introduce you to tonight's speaker, Dr. Nora Donoghue, who I've gotten to know over the last few weeks. It's always great to have another Roman archaeologist here in the Inland Northwest to chat about. She's a little bit earlier than me, but that's okay. We can all have our own kind of specialties in the kind of Roman or even earlier period. I just go towards the end of it. Dr. Donoghue received her BA in Classics from the University of Massachusetts in 2013, a master's in classical studies from Columbia University, and a PhD in classics from Florida State University, which she completed, according to the website I reviewed earlier this morning, in the summer of 2024. Did I get all that right? Yes. All right. Dr. Donoghue has worked on excavations at Hadrian's Villa, the Cosa excavations, and where we're going to be speaking about tonight. I believe you are the site director on, or one of the site directors on, the Poggio Civitate Etruscan workshops, right? So Dr. Donoghue is currently a lecturer of classical civilizations and history right here in town at Gonzaga. And we were very pleased to get her. She's here for a year, so it's fantastic to have her come and give a chat with our society. So I'm very much looking forward to this talk, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Nora Donoghue.
Hi, everyone. And thank you, Brian, for that introduction. Ooh, we have movie theater lighting, I see. It's very nice to be here. It's kind of a unique experience to be able to give a presentation in the chapter that you're currently a part of. So I'm extra excited to be able to share my research with you. I'm excited that some of my students I can see are also on Zoom and in the room, which makes me extra happy because they have to listen to me more than once a week. And now they have volunteered to come here tonight, which I really appreciate. There's a few things recently that I've been really excited about in talking about archaeology. I'm excited to talk to you about my research. I've recently also had the fun experience of speaking with a whole series of middle schoolers. I'm not sure if you've come across this in AIA programming this year, but the program First Robotics, this is a middle school and high school program that makes robots. So at the middle school level, they do this out of Legos, which is what you're seeing here. So they're tiny robots. And at the high school level, they make them out of big pieces of metal. So they're like 4 feet tall and things. And they compete with each other in games. In this year's game, the theme is archaeology. And so AIA has been connecting various experts, I say experts because I'm one of them, so I feel weird saying I'm an expert, but experts with these teams to talk to them about research projects. So they have to come up with a research project based around an issue that they see in archaeology today. And I've gotten to talk with, I think, about 10 teams of middle schoolers so far this year. And it's been very nice to connect with these school children who are excited about archaeology. I can tell you their conversations have been very energetic. And when I say like 10 different teams of middle schoolers, I mostly mean chaotic, but also very delightful. So it's been nice to see that there's a lot of people right now who are excited about archaeology. And I hope you can sort of take a look at some of the things that these school children are researching right now. I learned from them that they mostly think that archaeology can, one, entirely be solved by AI, that we could scan things and the AI will solve all of our problems. But they also think that we dig mostly in extremely highly dangerous situations. So either on like caves or on the sides of cliffs. I had one team that was curious about whether we ever dig like dangling from ropes, which I would love to do, but have not done. And little do they know, however, that I actually dig somewhere that looks like this. So I'm extremely fortunate to dig in the middle of Tuscany, in rural Tuscany, which has these beautiful sunrises that we walk by in the morning. There's also quite nice food there. And if you're a fan of Italian wine, which I imagine some people in this room might be, that hill that you see all the way over there on the right is Montalcino, one of the most well-known red wine towns in Tuscany. So it's quite a difficult life, but somebody has to do this. Exactly. I've worked here at Poggio Civitate, which is sometimes also called Morlo. So if you ever try to follow up and research this site, as I hope you will, you'll see it under both names. I worked there since 2012. I first went as an undergrad, supported by fellowships from the AIA, actually, which was how I got into working here. And then I essentially just stayed for so long that now I work as site director and get to work directly with students in the field. It's also an exciting year for Poggio this year. Excavations have worked mostly continuously since 1966, which means that this is the 60th anniversary of the excavation. The only exception to that rule, when I say mostly, is 2020, when we could not run as a program. So this marks our 60th anniversary, and there's going to be some new and exciting research that's coming out and some celebrations with red wine, of course, as a result of this anniversary. Before I keep going, I'm curious how many people here feel confident saying they're familiar with Etruscans. Well, that's pretty good. Okay, how many of those people have ever heard of Poggio Civitate? Okay, good. My husband says yes, which is a good sign here. Okay, so in this talk, the first section will have sort of two broad sections. In the beginning, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about who the Etruscans are, and then I'll go through the chronology of the site of Poggio Civitate, so you have a sense of what kind of archaeology we have here, and also what we're doing now. So I'll talk a little bit about recent excavations, and when I say recent, some of these things are things that we just, I guess it's kind of late now, but it feels like we just finished them in August. So this is sort of our current research that is as of yet unpublished. And then I'm going to talk about some of my specific research that is inspired by some of our recent excavations on cross-craft studies. So I'm particularly interested in how craft production and different craft production processes at this site relate to each other and what that can tell us about the craftspeople. And we'll do this looking at a workshop that dates to the Orientalizing period here. If that period doesn't make any sense, it will shortly, I hope. And then at the very end, we'll take a look at some case studies that can tell us a little bit about the craftspeople or maybe the social dimension of craft production that we have at Poggio Civitate. Okay. So the Etruscans, if you haven't met them before, I hope you will meet them and keep looking into them. This is the pre-Roman group of people that are living mostly in central Italy, so roughly defined in antiquity by the area of Etruria, or in the modern region. It's a little bit wider, their space, than modern Tuscany, but essentially around that same space. When the Etruscans first emerge as a culture, they emerge in the Iron Age. After the Iron Age, they begin to kind of coalesce into hilltop settlements in the Orientalizing period that's characterized by international trade. So when we talk about Orientalizing, we're often talking about trade from the East. It's kind of a problematic term, which I'll talk more about later. But some of the ways that we measure this are by objects that don't originate in Etruria that we can see. So in this example here, wait, Brian taught me how to do this. He said Control L for laser. There we go. I did it. So this here is a fibula, an object that is an Etruscan object. It's essentially a safety pin that can hold large pieces of cloth together. But the bead that you see on it is amber. Amber is a Baltic resource that is imported in this period. You start to see other types of objects coming into Etruria that are from areas like Egypt. So this is one of my absolute favorite objects from all of antiquity. It's a tiny hedgehog. It's an Erybolus, so it probably held perfume. It's made out of faience, which is a bluish, kind of greenish glaze that's made out of Egypt. In the Archaic period, this is when we really get monumental architecture that's being built in Etruria. So you start to get things like big Italic style temples that will influence the Romans, like this one from Veii. These temples often also have significant architectural terracottas, like this Apollo, who would have been on the rooftop of this temple. Poggio has evidence of all of these periods, so we'll see the evidence specifically there. Other places in Etruria have a lot of funerary evidence, like this wall painting you have from Tarquinia. I think generally when you hear about Etruscans, you often hear that they're like mysterious, in part because they have a language that's a non-Indo-European language. So the inscriptions that we have from Etruria are not related to the inscriptions that we have in other language groups at the time, which makes it difficult for us to translate. So the longest text that we have is this one you're seeing. This is the Liber Lenteus, which is now in Croatia, in Zagreb. Which is the longest text in Etruscan. The things that I'll show you in Etruscan have very short words from Poggio Civitate. We know a lot of Etruscan names, and we have a sense of how the grammar works, but often you hear that we can't read Etruscan at all. We can read a fair amount of it. We just don't have longer texts to read about them. Okay, that's the Etruscans in 30 seconds. Now let's talk about the Etruscans at Poggio Civitate. So Poggio Civitate is here south of Siena. It's located on a hilltop that's along a group of hills that are called the Colline Metallifere, which in Italian means the metal-bearing hills, and they do have metal resources in this space. This is part of the Crete Senese Valley. It's close here to the Ombrone River. So you can see there's Siena, here's Poggio. If you are keeping track of wine towns at home, Montalcino is like right next to it here. So Poggio is perhaps best known for its archaic complex, which we'll see in a minute, but we have archaeology that dates to all of these time periods. The first in the late Iron Age is mostly scant evidence from the site. So we have stray ceramic finds that can date to the Iron Age, but it's not really until the beginning of the 7th century BCE that we begin to have wide-scale evidence of things like domestic architecture or houses that survive. Recently, this is the result of the last 10 years of excavation or so, we've had to add early Orientalizing in as a time period in our chronology, because at the beginning of the 7th century BCE, we recently excavated a residence. So we have a long, more monumental rectilinear residence that at the moment is named Early Phase Orientalizing Complex Building 4. The naming at the site is complex, and I will talk about it in just a minute in relation to the workshop structure. So this residence is characterized by a tile roof, which we can tell because we have elements of roofing tiles that were found on the outside and the inside of the walls of the building. There is also some early architectural decoration. This was somewhat of a surprise to us because this is fairly early in date for architectural decoration of this type, but there's definitely some pieces of things like horned terracotta decoration that would have been on the roof. You can maybe see here, hopefully, that these walls of this building are quite long. They're also built up against the bedrock of the hill. So this big piece you're seeing there is a piece of bedrock. There's a little bit of an internal division for a room. So this is the wall you can see here with kind of a back room. Then there's a wider front porch that opens in this direction. So I'm about to show you a closer picture of this porch, but it's facing a different direction. So you're about to see this right here. So in the front, oh boy, there we go, of the porch, there is evidence for significant heat exposure, which you can see from the discoloring of the soil there, and significant evidence for metal production. So here there's a number of fragments of what we call slag, which is a byproduct of either iron or bronze production. It's sort of metallic and usually fairly heavy. There's also ceramic vessels that seem to have been used to help with metal production. And you're seeing one here on the left where you have, we call this impasto. It's a local type of clay. And this is the shoulder of a vessel covered in this metallic byproduct here, slag, that was being used to create metal in the front part of this house. We'll see later in this talk that there are areas of the site that have metal production that is happening in a more industrial, kind of localized place. So it's particularly interesting to see that in this early period, we have evidence of metal production elsewhere in the site, but in this somewhat significantly large and more permanent building, we're seeing it on the front porch. We first found evidence of this building in 2014, and it was excavated up until the last couple years. The publication is currently being written, but once we found it, we had to re-review some other archaeological evidence that was found in the 90s. So here we have early phase Orientalizing Complex Building 5. So this building is significantly less well preserved. It's these 3 big pieces of stone that you can see that appear to function as the bottom for wooden columns. So we usually call these column pads. They're particularly similar in style to column pads that I will show you in a few slides. So it seems like maybe this building relates to some of the later phases. It's really hard to determine what the function of it is because it's so fragmentary. This area of the hill is built up at a later period, and so things are kind of obscured by this fact. But it seems like there's at least more than one permanent building in this early phase for Etruscan archaeology. In the second quarter of the mid-7th century BCE, these elite activities, we kind of assume that this Epoch 4 building is elite because it's made out of these permanent materials. These elite activities are going to shift eastward, and they're centralized around part of the hill that's now called Piano del Tesoro. So when this site was first found in the 1920s, looking at there sort of surveys happening of different spaces that could have archaeological finds, this hill was identified as one where local people were finding objects, which is how it got its name, Piano del Tesoro, or like Hill of the Treasure, which is a good place usually to look for archaeology, Hill of the Treasure. And this is where the second phase of monumental architecture is built, which consists of 3 structures that date to the second half of the 7th century BCE. These are now called the Orientalizing Complex, and these 3 buildings have separate functions. This one up here that's also long and rectilinear, like Epoch 4 that you saw, is most likely a residence and contained ceramics that were of high quality. This building is actually the first of the 3 that was found by excavators, and it's directly underneath the later phase. So when they first discovered it, they thought it was either the foundations to the later phase in the Archaic complex, or they thought that it was maybe like a basement at first related to this structure. And it was over time that they figured out that it was actually like a full, complete earlier phase. So this structure is tripartite, divided into 3, something that in Etruscan archaeology is often used as a way to describe spaces that might be like religious spaces, but it's very hard for us to say function-wise if that's what's happening in this building. So we often just call it the tripartite building for this purpose. And then the third building is this very long open air building that's down here. This building most likely functioned as a workshop. I say most likely, it definitely functioned as a workshop. There's a lot of craft production objects that were found within it, and it is the one that we'll return to at the end of this talk for some time. These buildings together have been named a complex because they share architectural decoration. And I'm going to show you in a few slides one of these column pads. So keep that one right above this pointer in mind because I'm going to show it to you in a photo. We call it Sicily because it's shaped like Sicily. This workshop and these other buildings are unified together into one complex by a shared decorative scheme on the roof. So this is called a lateral cyma. It's the edge of the roof if you were looking at a roof that is tilted towards the ridgepole. Here you have alternating female face anafixes and feline head waterspouts. So these would have lined the edge of the building, and here you have these female faces. They have hair, kind of long hair on either side of their faces. They're very stylized, as is consistent with this time period. And then you have these open mouth feline waterspouts. One of the functions of these types of architectural decoration, when you have structures that are made out of like not stone or not permanent materials, is to help direct water away. If you have mud brick walls, they will melt if you let your rain touch them. And so these water spouts would help to move that water away. Okay, so these roof tiles, I'll show you some of them in situ in a minute. If you're not familiar with how ancient roofs are fitted together, there are long flat tiles that have edges that are called pan tiles. That's these ones that are across here. And then when you line those up, if they each have edges and you put them next to each other, there would be a small gap where the tiles meet, and you put curved tiles over that, which are called cover tiles. And so that's these cover tiles. So when you see them in a jumble in a second, I'll point some of these shapes out to you. Okay, now we also have, in addition to the female faces on this lateral cyma, the edge of the roof, there are some male faces, though they're much less numerous. So these alternating images that we have of felines and females have often been interpreted as what's called the Lady of the Animals, or Patnia Theron. Patnia Theron is a Greek phrase that refers to images usually of a deity that's associated with the East. This image is often associated with fertility, and in the Etruscan world has been associated with the Etruscan deity Uni. So when you have Patnia Theron, most often you have the woman in the middle, like holding wild animals. So sometimes she's holding some sad cats like up by the back feet. Sometimes they're kind of flanking her and sitting on either side. We have similar images of a woman on drinking cups here at Poggio who's also holding two braids of her hair on the cups. All of these images are ones that you can find in Eastern cultures as well. So the Patnia throne is one that comes in from things like Assyrian art. So each of these buildings has this decorative scheme, which is why we unite them together into one complex, because they share the same decoration in their roofs. They also were adorned on the top of their roofs with triangular lotus and palmette acroteria. So these are fairly early for acroteria in this period in Etruria. This one was in addition to this man riding a horse that most likely belonged to the residence building. This complex was destroyed at the end of the 7th century BCE or very early in the 6th century BCE by a fire that destroys all three of the structures, and probably starts in the workshop where they're using fire to make various craft objects. In the workshop, which I'll show you in a minute, there are also footprints that are preserved in tiles. These tiles were laid out on the ground to dry, so they had not yet gone into the kiln, and it seems like people who were around the Orientalizing complex as it started to burn down leave by stepping on them and leaving their foot impressions in them. So these are not fired tiles, so they're very crumbly now because they've just dried out and then been underground, but this is a cover tile that you can see curvy here with a good footprint. Here's some pan tiles that are laid down. And here's another image when it was excavated of one of these footprints in the tile itself. Okay, so this workshop structure in the Orientalizing complex was reopened for excavations in 2019. And we excavated that eastern extent that I pointed out. So this column pad that I called Sicily is the one that I was pointing to on the plan. In this image, these stones most likely supported wooden columns that supported the roof. These are the column pads. So this is the northernmost line of the building, and this is the middle column line. The last column on this side is actually like out in these trees, close to the edge of a sort of erosional cliff now. So we reopened this originally in the hopes of looking at how the column pads and the floor surface interacted with each other in order to answer questions about how the columns would have attached to the column pads, because it's an interesting setup for these wooden columns to be anchored on the stones themselves. We'll see a reoccurring theme in this, that when we open things with questions we imagine are relatively simple to answer, we often just get more questions, which is sort of what happened here, where over a period of a few excavation seasons, I excavated this area and the area to the north. One thing that we found is that there are holes in the floor, gaps in the floor surface. This is like a wattle and daub floor, where it seems like things were countersunk into the floor surface itself. So they have this hole here, there's this long line, and then this hole in the floor as well. We have a kind of working hypothesis that this may have been for something like a press, maybe like an olive press. And then to the north of the building, we found a depression in the ground, which we weren't actually expecting, because we always thought that the area to the north of this building was very level and was used for productive activities as well. But you can see in this image here that the roof collapses when the building burns to the north. And this is a jumble of roof tiles that have fallen off of the roof. When this was excavated in the 1980s, they stopped just above this. And so when I reopened it, we found all the tiles underneath. And we can see here that some of the pan tiles, that's one of those big wide tiles I pointed to, slid off the roof. And then a bunch of the cover tiles have fallen upside down. So here's a full width of the cover tile here. There's another full width cover tile. There's a whole cover tile that's broken here laying on top of them. In between these tiles, and this was quite an exciting find for us, we also found part of a carbonized wooden beam. Finding trace evidence of wood can be rather difficult in this area of Etruria, so it was exciting to be able to identify a wood type. Here is a big fragment of it in the ground. I know it doesn't look very impressive, but it was exciting because the carbon held the form of the wood. So it has the shape and the grain preserved in it. There are carbon specialists who can type these types of carbon evidence, which we're hoping to have done in the next couple years. We removed a section of this beam in order to study it, which we did in a method called lifting, which is when you excavate down on either side and then kind of cut underneath and remove something very delicate held in a soil package. It was very, very heavy, but we have it now wrapped up in our lab, ready for future investigations. So we'll return to the Orientalizing period in just a minute, but I do want to show you the final period of occupation at this site, which after the whole Orientalizing complex is destroyed by a fire, we see the construction of a new four-winged structure that dates to the 6th century BCE, which seems to have combined the functions of the site's other earlier buildings into one. At the very end of its phase, when the building is still standing, we see that there is some defensive works that are constructed. So you can tell there's towers here on either end. These are defensive towers that were constructed towards the end of its occupational phase. Also, just note this wall that's sort of built here on this edge and on the southern edge and then ends. We'll talk about that wall in a minute. So this archaic complex is maybe the best known of these three phases, in part because it has significant architectural decoration. You can see some of them in this reconstruction along the roof there, but the best known example is this cowboy acroteria, as it's called, that's in the middle. So in 1966, when this project started, it was an American-run project. So Americans show up on scene and they find this guy with a big hat. And so the Italians immediately named it the cowboy, and the Americans adopted that with enthusiasm quite quickly. But this cowboy is now actually the symbol of the region itself. So when you see like town cars or like the post office, they all have the cowboy on it. So the cowboy is particularly well known as an acroteria. He would have been up along the roof line. There's also different forms of frieze plaques that would have ran around the outside of the building. So here you have probably the best known of the group, which is a banquet scene, an early banquet scene. There's a dog under the couch. You have people reclining. There's people serving them. Here's a line drawing of a procession scene where you have a couple seated here in a wagon, and they're being shaded by a little umbrella, and people are carrying objects for them behind them. And then we have this one, which is usually called the seated figures frieze plaque. You have a series of figures who are sitting. Though there's one woman in the scene who has a much better chair than everyone else. She has like a throne, and she's opening her veil, and everyone else has various objects that they're holding. The one in front has this curved staff, which in Etruscan art is always referred to as a lituus. It's passed on to the Roman world and becomes a symbol of authority and power in the Roman world as well. There's also the Sphinx, which we have a mix of mythological and real animals that appear on the roof. The Sphinx is one that's fairly complete. And it's an interesting example for a Sphinx because not only is it standing, which you don't always see for Sphinxes, it's also male. I haven't checked every Sphinx, but I've been told that most of them are female. So it's interesting that we have the appearance of a male Sphinx on the roof line with them. Okay, so recently, to talk about some recent excavations that we've been working on, this is the plan of that archaic complex that I just showed you. And we were interested to look at this line up here of a wall that seemed to extend, that was excavated like 20 years ago and noted in documentation, but never fully explained as to why you have one projecting wall that's coming off. You can maybe tell from this plan that there are a series of large stones on the other side of that wall. So this past summer, excavations returned to this space to reinvestigate the wall itself. And we found here, this is the wall on the plan. I tried to angle it in the same way in this image here, but we actually found a new surprise wall that's significantly larger than this one. So this is over 1.25 meters wide. It's extremely wide, and it's built directly over the top of this wall projecting out of this corner from the archaic complex. We weren't necessarily expecting to find this wall here, but currently our hypothesis is that this little short wall that I pointed out to you on the plan that's defensive maybe went all the way around the complex, and we just haven't picked it up on this side. This side of the complex has significantly eroded since antiquity. So here we maybe have the edge of that defensive wall on the corner. The other thing that we didn't expect, we kind of imagined that with this wall projecting, it would have a wall that met it and that it would come this way on the plateau. But it seems like this wall is extending off into space in this direction, which is going to be interesting for us to investigate because this line of trees is a very significant drop that has eroded away. So this summer when we return, we're going to be looking in this area to try to determine if this has a wall that meets it on either side. We didn't find one on this side. And we're trying to determine where this defensive wall ends. And we know possibly from looking at the topography that the defensive wall runs all the way along this side. So this is particularly new and interesting information for us. The building of defensive works that we've previously detected were maybe a bit more robust than we expected. And this makes some sense because at the end of the 6th century BCE, this building is completely and utterly destroyed systematically. So there is evidence that the sculptures are torn off the building and they're disposed of essentially in groups that are sometimes organized by type around the building. So it seems to be intentionally destroyed. In 2015, we found part of an altar that had been broken in half and thrown down a well. So not only is the building destroyed, but potentially the water sources on the hilltop are also being interrupted intentionally. So they seem to have been a good decision in trying to build up their defensive works. We also, this past summer, excavated in this 2 summers ago, actually, excavated in this empty space that is here, which we call the Eastern Terraces, and found trace elements of a structure here as well. To be very honest, we had put people in this area who had not excavated their own trenches before, thinking that it was very safe. And then they found a big building that we weren't expecting. And so you can maybe see in this plan, this drawing here, and also in this aerial drone shot, that there are 2 rather trace walls. They're only one course, so this is the very lowest level, most likely, of the wall that exists. And in it, there are pieces of pottery. So they're hard to see in the aerial shot, but that curvy piece that's right above the pointer here is the base of a large storage vessel. There's a very large base of a storage vessel over here where we have some bigger rocks at the corner that seem to make the end of this wall. So it's a nice 90-degree corner that we have extending in this direction. The problem is that we can't find where the other walls are at this point in time. So we have trace elements of the wall that most likely is the return wall, meaning this one coming this direction. This is interrupted by these trees, which we are not allowed to kill or cut down, and most likely are obscuring our ability to see the extension of this wall. My own trench this past summer was in this space, and I do think we have a pretty good argument for the return wall being in this area. We also would like to find a south wall since most buildings have 4 walls. And so we have been investigating this space that's unexcavated in this plan this past summer, looking for this southern wall of this structure. We imagine that this structure is a domestic structure because of the storage vessels that we're finding within it. We also found some amber, and there's also some trace elements of archaic architectural decoration. So we think this is most likely an archaic building, and we just haven't found the southern wall. But when we were excavating in this space, imagining that we were very easily going to find the southern wall, instead, we didn't. And we found what looks to be redeposited soil in this area. And when we began to excavate that, we in fact found a large worked stone that's most likely a stele. So steles in antiquity are sometimes used as boundary markers. They're often large worked stones. Some of them have letters, which we were hopeful this one would have, and some of them have sculpture. This is longer than a meter. It's about 1.16 meters long. So this is a very significant large worked stone. There aren't many large work stones from Poggio Civitate. The altar that I mentioned that was thrown down the well is the exception to the rule. The stone is also not local. So it's a non-native sedimentary stone that seems to have been brought in from somewhere else that doesn't originate on the hilltop itself and then worked into this shape. We found this part was projecting when we first discovered the rock, but then interestingly, it's leaning against bedrock on this side. And that space was left open. So to the great excitement of the excavators, there was a hole that opened in the ground and we could stick a tape measure like quite deep in it, which is what told us that this was a much bigger object than we were originally expecting. It was very difficult to move. So it was fully excavated this summer, but we had to get it from a hilltop that is a good 15 to 20-minute hike straight up down to the lab in order to study it. We had various ideas and methods of how this would work, but safety-wise, we ended up going with a mechanical excavator. After we fully excavated it, we used the excavator to pick it up out of the trench, lift it about 6 feet, and at one point, the excavator put it down and then couldn't pick it back up until we readjusted the straps, so it almost lived there for the rest of the time. But it has been safely moved into our magazzino and is now currently being studied. So you maybe can see in this image that it has 2 worked faces. So this part of the stone is very flat. There's one kind of indentation here on it that may be a tool mark. Maybe it was originally something like a letter or part of decoration that has been sheared off. And there's one molded edge. So this face is also flat and this edge is molded. It's not very finished here. So one hypothesis is that this is the bottom that would have been in the ground to hold it upright and that it has fallen backwards into this space. When we took it out of the trench, behind it were all of these other stones that are sticking out. We don't know how big they are yet. We know this one goes back at least 60 centimeters because we can measure where it's leaning on this bedrock shelf here. But we're not sure if these other stones that seem to be the same type are related to the stele or our other stele, which we would really like. So that is something that we'll have to investigate this summer. This doesn't solve our problem of where our southern wall is in the building, but it does explain that maybe it's interrupted in a later phase when these objects are deposited there, and that's why we can't find it. Another perplexing element of this stele is this terracotta face, which was found in this space in between the original stele I showed you and this bedrock. This face, maybe you can tell from its stylistic elements, does not look like most of the pottery that we have from Poggio Civitate, and we are guessing that it is later. We don't have evidence of Poggio existing in the Hellenistic period, the period after the Archaic period. It could be imported, which is something that we're currently working on, but we're a little perplexed by its presence here. It's curved on the back, so it's potentially part of a vessel, like if you have a human face on the edge of a ceramic vessel. It could maybe also be a hollow terracotta figurine and we only have the face. It appears to either have an interesting hairdo or a headdress that it's wearing on its hair here. And then we have most of each side of its face. So this is an interesting and exciting element of the excavations that we found, which we of course found in the very last 4 days of excavation, which made it extra exciting and stressful. So this is what we will be working on next year when we return, is trying to figure out what these other worked stones are and how they get here and whether they actually interrupt the architecture that would have remained from ETAP 1 from this early building. Okay, so it was the recent excavations in the workshop that made me interested or extra interested in craft production. And craft production at Poggio Civitate has significant evidence in all time periods. And this is especially true for textile manufacturing, where we have both in domestic and non-domestic context, significant evidence for textile production objects. So in this next section, I'm going to focus on that craft production occurring within the workshop space, which you've already seen is a very long area. This is a long, narrow building that was 54 meters long, which is actually very big for this time period in Italy. It's 8.5 meters wide, and it was most likely open to the air. So we have these column pads that were supporting the roof. Production activities most likely occurred under that roof space, but then probably also extended into the northern area where I showed you those tiles that had fallen in. This workshop was excavated throughout the 1980s, and then excavation paused. They essentially had so many materials to work through that they stopped. They leveled everything to the level of the floor surface and then stopped to process the finds. Now, I've talked a little bit about naming conventions so far at this site, and I'll do that again for the workshop. When this was first found, it was called the Southeast building because it was southeast of where they were working. So they labeled it the southeast building. When it became clear over time that the objects they were finding were related to craft production, they began to call it the workshop. So there is scholarship that was published and site reports that were published that use both names, the workshop and the southeast building. And in order to clarify that, it was determined that the naming system had to be redone to avoid confusion. So it was called the Orientalizing Complex, and the Orientalizing Complex was given numbers of the buildings. So it always appears in publications as Orientalizing Complex 2/workshop. So OC2, you'll see in some slides in the rest of this. But recently, the term Orientalizing has gone somewhat out of favor in the Etruscan sphere. Orientalizing, as I said, this period is characterized by objects that are coming in vaguely from the East. And because the Orient is not a term that refers to a specific culture or a specific place, and also has a lot of baggage in the 19th century, we mostly have moved away from it, and people generally use either the middle period or the intermediate period. We've already redone the naming conventions once, however, so now we mostly talk about it like this. The intermediate period Orientalizing Complex 2/workshop is the structure that I'll talk about. Okay, so this complex, or this structure, the workshop itself, provides a very unique opportunity to study Etruscan craft specializations and technological practices from the 7th century BCE. It's fairly unique in being such a robust workshop from this time period. So we're going to take a look at how the production processes that are going on in this workshop relate to each other, how materials like tools or raw materials may have been shared in the space, and how immaterial resources like technological knowledge may have been swapped around between craftspeople through a lens that's called cross-craft interactions. So this type of study tries to look at how these production processes might interrelate to each other, and also in turn tell us what that might show about social relations. So specifically, we're going to look at how the sharing of material and immaterial resources contribute to the cross-craft interactions within Orientalizing Complex Building 2/workshop, and what the analysis of multi-craft production can reveal about the organization of labor and specialization of skills. So this structure housed productive activities on a large scale, although interestingly, there's very limited evidence for the export of these products. There's like one fragment of something that we can certainly say is from Poggio that's not at Poggio. So there's no evidence that these objects are circulating. They're all being consumed either by this community or by communities immediately around it. So a wide range of crafts were practiced under its roof, which include bronze working, bone and antler carving, food processing, ceramic and terracotta production, textile production, and even a small amount of early glass production. These excavations of the structure OC2, I won't keep calling it its whole name, were published in a series of reports by the then director Eric Nielsen throughout the 1980s, following the completion of the summer seasons. This excavation from its very earliest days has been dedicated to publishing its data very quickly. In the early 2000s, this continued by creating a public-facing database which includes images and descriptions of all the cataloged artifacts, which has now been updated into a new database that's called Open Context. So some of the artifacts that I'm going to show you will have numbers underneath them, and those numbers are related to their numbers in Open Context, which is how you can track them down. So due to the nature of these serial publications, a comprehensive monograph dedicated to the excavation of this building specifically has not yet been published. But there have been numerous publications that establish its architectural form, its dating, its naming, clearly, its individual artifact classes, including bucero, ivory and bone, textile production, a specific type of cup that's made in this building that's called a wing-handled cup, the inscriptions that we have found here, and metal finds. Through this lens, some scholars have also started to look at the possible identities of the craftsmen or craftspeople, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end. Now, scholarship in the Mediterranean has increasingly addressed questions of craft production and social dynamics through the use of this theory, cross-craft interactions. A key theoretical approach in informing this work involves establishing relationships between multiple production processes. And the term that is used for this is the chain abattoir. I try not to say French in front of live audiences, but here we go. So chain abattoirs is a concept that's developed in 1985 by French archaeologists for the study of Middle Paleolithic lithic objects that aims to identify all steps in a production process. So if you're talking about the chain abattoir of bread production, for example, you wouldn't just consider the loaf of bread the final object. You would consider every step in the process of making bread, like growing the grain, harvesting it, milling it, and all the possible social interactions and technological knowledge that's involved in every step of the process. American archaeologists in the 1990s expanded on this theory to consider the social dimensions of production. So scholars like Pierre Lemonnier in his 1992 work emphasized the role of social and cultural factors in shaping technical choices. He argues that these choices carry social meanings and impacts. Prehistoric archaeologist Marcia Ann Dobrace also highlights the human element in technology and craft production and demonstrates how the practice of ceramic production shapes individual and group identities. So it's from this that this cross-craft theories have been developed in archaeology and more recently in the Mediterranean. So these studies in Mediterranean craft production have seen an increase in emphasizing what's called cross-craft and multi-craft relationships in the last decade. Some notable works to consider are Astrid van Ooyen's work on Terra Sigillata in the Roman Empire. You're seeing the cover of that there on the right. And Bryce Bart's work on cross-cultural craft interactions, which you're seeing on the left there. And also a recent 2024 book by Meredith and Murphy, who look at late antique cross-craft production in the Mediterranean. So these studies all emphasize the interrelated natures of craft production. So some important terms to consider. One is this term multi-crafting. Multi-crafting is production that's undertaken by craft workers that are related in some way. So people who are practicing more than one craft in the same space, people who have more than one craft specialization, perhaps they have family ties, or they're bound by physical proximity. So this workshop that we're going to look at with all these production processes would be considered multi-craft by these theoretical approaches. They're all what we call interrelated crafts as well. So one good example that exists in the Etruscan world is the example of bucero. So bucero objects like this, if you haven't seen bucero before, this is an Etruscan ceramic type that is shiny and dark in color. And as early as 1970, there was a hypothesis put forth by Nancy Ramage. If you've ever taken a big Roman archaeology survey class, Nancy Ramage wrote a book with her then husband Ramage called Ramage and Ramage. That's one of the big archaeology Roman survey books. And she puts forth a hypothesis that bucero is attempting to imitate metal forms. So here there's maybe decoration, like this rolled decoration that you see in metal vessels. There's some hatching that you have on the edge here. That's also something that you see on metal vessels. Also, the burnished, shiny color of the bucero was maybe thought to imitate bronze or silver vessels. This is a good example of what we would call cross-craft relations. A cross-craft interaction or a cross-craft interrelation is practices or shared resources or shared decorative motifs that exist between related industries. So this particular example is exceptionally good because we would have interrelated design elements between metal and ceramic production. So despite the fact that Etruscan archaeology has this excellent example of bucero that's widely accepted, this example of cross-craft interactions in ceramic studies, it's one that hasn't been necessarily used to look at Etruscan craft production more widely. So here we're going to attempt to do this and take a look at some cross-craft interactions. One scholar named Shimida also introduces this term, which is intra-cross-craft interactions. It's a bit clunky. It has a lot of hyphens here, but here this is looking at the different styles or technological knowledge you need within one industry. So if we take ceramic industry, for example, there might be objects that have more than one craftsperson that work on them, need more than one material, have different types of production processes, or maybe composite objects that have multiple things coming together to make one object. There's also this term composite object, And this is when you have an object that's specifically made out of more than one material with different production processes. So furniture is a good example of this. If you have fancy furniture that's wood that has inlaid carvings in it, this would be a good example of a composite object. Okay, so let's consider first the ceramic and terracotta production in the workshop. The workshop produces a wide variety of ceramic and terracotta objects, such as architectural terracottas and pottery in the western half of the building. Although no kiln can be confidently associated with the workshop, clay balls that preserve the indent of hands fired during the event that burned down the building suggest that clay was stored in the building itself. So these are balls of clay that have been like squished by people that were fired when the building burns. There's also a mold. We have one mold from the workshop. It is this one here on the right. The mold for the male head anafix found on the workshop floor also provides direct evidence that the roofing elements used in the complex itself were created here. The presence of numerous roof tiles, the ones with the footprints, laid out on the floor to dry in the center area of the workshop, further suggests that the majority of the production processes for architectural terracottas occurred within this space. The acroteria found within the complex itself, so possibly decorating the building itself, also demonstrate a variety of techniques on these clay pieces to make the decoration. So they're made out of molds, the shape. So we see mold making techniques, and then there's also the application of incised decoration to create the details. These are the lines that are actually drawn into the clay when it's still somewhat wet. A further interesting piece of evidence for architectural terracotta production in this space are what excavation documentation referred to as ribbons of unfired clay. These ribbons are the same length and width of the frieze plaques that are used in the later period archaic complex. So potentially these are unfired frieze plaques or revetment plaques that haven't made it to the kiln yet. Evidence also points to local ceramic production, including the creation of Bucaro ware. Birkin, a scholar who specifically studies the Bucaro at Poggio Civitate, in its 2003 study identifies a locally produced kyathos, that's what you're seeing here, which he determines as Poggio's type 3. This is characterized by a wide, deep, convex curving bowl, a short and vertical rim, and a conical foot that has a very thick stem. On the body itself, there are 15 scalloped shapes that are pressed out after the vessel has been made. They have rounded edges that serve as the decoration for the bowl. So some of these, interestingly, this one, the handle is broken off, but some of them, the scallops continue all the way around the bowl and the handle is just stuck on. And then in others, the scallop makes spaces for the handle. So maybe there's more than one person that's making this shape in the workshop. The production of this kyathos demonstrates a blend of techniques that are occurring under the workshop roof. So the basic form was achieved by throwing the pot on a wheel. Then a mold was used while the pot was still on the wheel to achieve the wide, flat shape. And then the scallops themselves were outpressed after the vessel was no longer on the wheel. The handles were then later attached. And the handles that we do have that preserve from this type show a combination of manufacturing methods, which include plastic applied decoration. This means like sculptural forms that are made in molds and attached on actual plastic, mold made decoration, and mold made finials, so decorative things that come to a point. In addition to Bucaro, the workshop also produced impasto vessels in a variety of wheel-thrown forms. Impasto is a term for a local clay and locally produced ceramic. A significant portion of this material is highly fragmentary, which makes the discussion of the vessel types or the production elements of the vessel types somewhat challenging. But I'll show you in a minute that there are shared features of stamped and incised decorations, which suggests a focus on the sort of surface embellishment that's shared across multiple ceramic media. The manufacture of ceramic spindle whorls, loom weights, and rocchetti. So these are spindle whorls that you would use to turn fiber into thread. Here you have, these are called rocchetti. They kind of look like spools, and it's assumed that they have a similar function where you could wrap thread around them. There's also a particular type of tablet weaving where you can make smaller decorative borders that may have used them to weigh down the fibers going in either direction. And then loom weights, which weigh down thread on a loom so that you can weave fabric into it. So these are all ceramic produced objects that are made in the workshop itself, which suggests a direct link between the craftspeople that are producing ceramic objects and the textile producers themselves. It's likely that the spinning of fibers also occurred within the workshop. And the rocchetti frequently feature stamped designs. You can sort of see the edge of one over here that range from geometric patterns to concentric circles, and then also to some figural representations such as quadrupeds, chimeras, and other animals. There's one that has a human on it, but only one. The connection between decoration on pottery, including impasto and bucaro and rocchetti, is found in the form of this stamped decoration, which uses similar palmette stamps. These are lotus palmette stamps. Some are identical also, here's our palmette stamps. And some of them are identical using this S shape with these concentric kind of lines. As you see here on the left with two rocchetti, these two spool-like objects, one of which is in bucaro, so it's a very nice material, and the middle one is made out of impasto. And then on the right, you have a bucaro vessel that has the same stamp that's used on it. So like pottery, some of these textile tools also feature incised decoration, which suggests shared artistic traditions between these objects, and potentially also maybe the same artisans, the same craftspeople who are working on a variety of these ceramic objects being produced in the same building. The presence of diverse ceramic technologies encompassing mold-made, terracotta, sculpture, wheel-thrown forms, and the blending of both within a single workshop context provides evidence for multiple overlapping chain abattoirs, these production processes, and also highly specialized knowledge of diverse techniques like incision or stamping or molds that are used on the wheel while things are being produced. So this multi-crafting of architectural terracottas, fine wares, and a utilitarian impasto vessels relate also to textile production objects that's facilitated by this shared cultural knowledge and shared resources like raw clay, heat source, its fuel, and these artisans who know how to use and make these objects. One object illustrates this, I think, really, really well, which is the top of a fenestrated vessel fragment. This is the lid of a fenestrated vessel. When we say fenestrated, which means it has windows, like those little holes that are in the top here. Here in this object, there are clay discs that were found contained within the finial itself. And these discs are actually just the clay that was punched out of these shapes that were found still contained in the middle. There's one other that's identical to this, and it doesn't have the ceramic discs inside, so it's potentially an accident that they were preserved here. But these clay discs that were punched out to create the fenestrations were done so using one of the decorative stamps that's used in the other objects. So if you look very closely at them, you can see there's a starburst design that was also on that bucaro vessel that I showed you a moment ago. So here we have at least a confident glimpse into the fact that we have shared tools that are being used to create diverse ceramic products and are maybe available to the artisans that are working under the workshop space. To switch relationships between crafts, let us also consider the evidence of metalworking, which mostly occurs in the eastern extent of the building. A fragment, here's metalworking. Here. A fragment of a double action bellows and also a terracotta pipe were found on the floor of the workshop. So they're found over here in this space. And this is what they look like. This is the bellows fragment. So this is a technical piece that would have been attached to probably an animal skin containing air. And you could then compress the animal skin like you would for a fireplace and add more air and oxygen into the fire to make it hotter. This particular piece is interesting. The double action element of it, it would inject air both when you compressed and when you inflated the bag. So the double sides here would be constantly adding air. It wouldn't be just every time you moved the bellow itself. Then we have the terracotta pipe, which you can tell has been exposed to heat down here, most likely for making the kilns hot enough in order to smelt or produce metal objects. So these ceramic elements were used to bring in more air and feed the fire. It could reach higher temperatures. This shows that we have here specialized airtight pieces that are being made in ceramic for metal production. So the artisans that are creating these have to be familiar with the production processes of both in order to correctly make these vessels. Furthermore, the presence of what we call crucibles or ceramic courseware vessels that are used for smelting metal during the casting process provides additional evidence for the interrelations of these two production processes. Crucibles have to be made out of a material that can withstand that heat, and they're usually a specific recognizable form. Also, while wooden forms may have been used for some of the metalworking processes like repoussé, this is hammered decoration into thin pieces of metal, clay could have also served for creating molds for castings. It's also possible, perhaps, that clay could have been used to assess the temperature. So those terracotta wasters that I showed you, the squished pieces of clay between hands, possibly could have even been used to check the temperature for metal production of a kiln. So this sort of further emphasizes the advantages of having multiple resources for multiple production processes occurring in one building. While the smelting of metal likely occurred in a different sector of the site, it would have been very smelly and hot, the final casting of small metal objects took place within the workshop space. These activities included the creation of fibulae, those safety pins, jewelry, general pins or nails, chains, and tools. Like you see here in this picture, these are crucible fragments all around on the side here with metal pieces stuck to them. Beyond simple casting, a range of decorative techniques were employed, encompassing incised plaques into metal, sheet cut decorations like you see with this tiny rosette, and castings of 3D forms. Significant numbers of fibulae were found within the workshop and throughout the complex that we can tell are made of local production. And significantly, in the 1980s, 2 bronze figurines, one of a nude wrestler in a kneeling position who seems to be holding his opponent's arm. The rest of his opponent is now lost. And the other, an umpire in a tunic who's holding some sort of long staff, are also thought to be of local production. These figures are unfinished on the back, so they may have been decorative elements attached to some sort of metal vessel, or perhaps like the support elements to a tripod used in the Orientalizing complex. The use of decorative silver foils have also been added to numerous bronze nails, which demonstrate an additional metalworking specialized technique, especially because we generally assume that the foils have been imported into the site for this purpose. So this diversity of techniques, much like that observed in ceramic production, highlights the range of technical practices occurring within one shared craft space. In the same area, animal processing, including the butchering of sheep, goats, and pigs, which make up about half of the bone assemblage from the whole site, as well as cattle, was undertaken. And the resulting bones were then utilized for carving within the workshop. Red deer, likely produced through elite hunting activities, these are big deer, were also processed. And commonly, their leg bones were split laterally using saws, and then their antlers were carved into plaques or tools. So here you have red deer leg bones. This one has been cut, and this one has a saw mark. It's partway done. And here, if we look at some antler, you have here antler that's been cut very straight on both sides. Okay, this one here on the right is only partially worked and has indents from a drill that was used in the carving process kind of all the way across its surface. This is most likely the type of tool that was used to create bone plaques. There are also a significant number of bone plaques. So these plaques exhibit a range of designs from geometric and petal motifs to 3-dimensional forms, such as a sphinx, which you're seeing there on the left, that's made out of antler. Bone plaques feature guilloche patterns, and some bone is carved into 3-dimensional shapes like this male face. This one's flat on the back. This one is round on the back. The example that's all the way here on the right may have been part of a plaque that was repurposed later into a male face. So in this section, you can see that kind of drill that was used on the antler. Ignore the sticker. It's really tiny, and it's our only way to adhere the number to this. So you have the drilled decoration here, but then on the other side, you have the carving of a male face. Because this seems to be where it's broken, most likely they were making a bone plaque that was wider. It broke, and then they reused the other side in order to make this smaller figurine. So these plaques may have been inset into wooden furniture, suggesting an additional cross-craft relation with woodworking, which we have significantly less evidence for because wood does not survive as well. So cross-craft connections with metal production are evident in 2 more significant examples. Here on the left, and this picture is from 1972, so I apologize that it's so grainy. There is a bone disc. So this is a piece of bone that has been cut and polished on both sides that was then covered in this accompanying gold foil. So a good composite object here. And then on the right, this is a petal-shaped fragment of bone where we still have it attached to a bronze nail that most likely would have connected this to a piece of furniture. The nail is bronze, but the head is covered in silver foil. So a high crossover of a combination of these different materials. So spatial analysis suggests that this bone carving and bronze production were intermingled in the eastern half of the workshop, which raises the possibility that these activities were carried out by the same people, or it was particularly beneficial that they were occurring in the same space. The then director at the time of his excavations in the 1990s first proposed the existence that potentially there's a shared pool of craftspeople possessing overlapping skill sets due to the similarity between sculpting molds for lost wax bronze casting and carving soft materials like these bone and antler plaques. Recent work by the current director, Tony Tuck, has further developed this idea, suggesting that artisans with sculpting expertise may have worked across multiple media with related sculptural activities that are all occurring within the eastern extent, which is why we're finding the evidence concentrated there. It's clear that these diverse production processes in this structure are sharing these raw materials and tools, and possibly labor. But most often when we're looking at cross-craft studies, we're interested in saying something about the social element, the lenses of social relationships, technological shared knowledge, maybe even religious practices, ritual, or identity. And so often in this workshop, we come very close to being able to say something about identity, even though our evidence for this is fairly tricky. One way that we can feel quite close to these craftsmen is through these terracotta wasters, like this one, which was originally was going to be a ceramic vessel, and something happens and the craftsman squishes it all up between his hands. Sometimes you can actually put your fingers in the same shape of whoever held this clay before it was fired. Like this is 2 finger impressions that your hand can lock into pretty nicely. There's some further evidence for possible identities of these craftspeople, and one comes in the form of this broken ricchetto that has an inscription on it that reads Rixa, so it reads this way from right to left here. This was actually found very early on in the excavation, and it wasn't until 2011 when a very bored student was brushing this to clean it with a toothbrush that the inscription itself was noticed and much excitement was had. This word doesn't actually exist in Etruscan anywhere else. So this is the only instance where we have rixa in an inscription in the Etruscan world. But following its grammar, it seems most likely that it's a feminine personal name. Textile production is often associated with women, so it's particularly attractive to us to think that this is maybe the personal object of a craftsperson working in the workshop. Maybe it's the identity of a person working in the workshop, but it is unfortunately the only instance of this text that we have. Also from the workshop on an impasto vessel, so made out of local clay, there is this inscription, which this one reads left to right. Etruscans keep you on your toes and go both directions. This one starts with a beta, so we have what looks to be a B here. In the second letter, you have what might be an iota with a cross mark, then an epsilon, and then a fragmentary letter that could be a variety of possibilities. The interesting thing about this inscription is the use of the beta, which would not have been spelled this way in Etruscan. So it seems most likely that this is an inscription that is actually Umbrian, a different language group from a different region in Italy. If it is Umbrian, it potentially is also a personal name, something maybe like Fibius, which is a common name in Umbrian, and we would just have the bis part, the last part of the word here. So it's interesting to think that we might have multi-gender groups that are working together in the workshop, and also maybe multilingual groups, people from different backgrounds that are all sharing technological knowledge in this space. So linking this evidence of production to social relationships presents some challenges, but let us very briefly consider 2 case studies. So if we map the locations of spindle whorls that are securely dated to the Orientalizing period across the complex, we see that larger whorls that exceed 1.5 centimeters are associated with the workshop itself. And if you map smaller whorls that measure less than 1.5 centimeters, they concentrate within the residence structure. In textile production, the larger the spindle whorl, the coarser the thread. And the finer the spindle whorl, the finer the thread production, the nicer the thread would be. So the spatial distribution pattern suggests that the production of the most refined threads were likely the responsibility for those residing in the elite residence. This distribution potentially might not be representative of a difference between domestic and industrial spaces, but instead it could potentially be the social status of the individuals involved. So the finer threads are reserved for the production of the upper class elite members of this site. This is particularly interesting in relation to our second case study, which concerns the faunal remains at the site. We're very lucky at Poggio Civitate that since 1966, excavators have kept bone remains for the most part. The collection processes have changed over time, but there is a large collection of faunal remains that were begun to be reviewed in 2012 by our zooarchaeologist named Sarah Kanza. She has been able to identify over 14,000 animal bones of specific types. This is where we get the pigs and the sheep. Most of these animals are domesticated. Less than half of them are wild, which you can tell from size. If we map securely orientalizing contexts with their animal bones, we can see that there's an interesting pattern in the animal butchery that's happening throughout the complex. So we see, first of all, that vertebrae, like you're seeing here all the way on the right, are very commonly split directly in half. So this one is cut directly down the middle. We also see, if you look at all of the bones, and particularly if you look at ulnas, sort of like the elbow, the tasty parts of pigs and sheep, that there is a strong pattern that divides them from the residence and the workshop, with the residence preferring right-sided ulnas and the workshop preferring left-sided. This is high numbers. So at the residence, there's 706 to date right sides, and in the workshop, there's 907 to date left sides. In a 2013 study, a zooarchaeologist named McKinnon studied a similar side preferencing in Greek sanctuaries, which sees that of the faunal remains that are offered in Greek sanctuaries, there is a preference to right-sided bones that are being offered. So this is interesting for us, that potentially there's something more valuable about the right-sided elements of these animal carcasses. They're being reserved for elite members of the site and going to the elite residence, but the left sides are staying in that workshop space and are being used to create these bone plaques that we saw. So this example, both of these examples illustrate that production at Poggio Civitate was both highly specialized and also highly organized. This paper has explored these theoretical frameworks that posit that craft production involves embedded social practices. And these examples further demonstrate that the Etruscans of Poggio Civitate likely also perceive production as an intrinsically linked to social positions or social relations in some way. We also saw the multi-craft nature of production activities in this orientalizing complex workshop. And by examining the sharing of these resources that are both material and immaterial, we've illuminated some interconnectedness, interrelations of these various industries that operate within one building. The sharing of these material resources, such as raw materials, like butchered animal bones that might only be right-sided, clay, the shared heat source, the production use of tools that are utilized across multiple products reinforces this interconnected nature of the productive environment of the orientalizing complex building too. Okay, so this is particularly, I think, well illustrated by the spindle whorl distribution and interestingly also by the faunal remains. Thank you. Hi, Brian.
I have a silly question. I was struck by the footprints. And, you know the size of the feet? Do we know divide it perhaps to age or gender or anything like that?
No. So one difficulty in determining age or gender in the size and shape of the footprints is that we're not sure how much the clay would have shrunk as it dried or as it like half fires in the fire itself. But they're svelte feet. So the knife's footprint is certainly much smaller than my foot. It's like this big. Yeah.
When you were talking about the spindles and the fibers, was there a diversity of fibers that they were using, or was it like a specific element?
That's a good question. So there's a diversity in the types of spindle whorls. We think that generally coarser like fibers in general are being used to do things like rope. So you might have some organic materials that are maybe plant-based for things like rope. But then the other ones probably are wool from sheep. We know that they're raising sheep and that they're using them possibly either only for wool production or also for cheese production, maybe, as opposed to meat. Their finer threads are probably going to be like nicer, finer wool. Yeah, it's a good question. Yes, that's a very far back question.
To have a building that large and that busy, any idea what the population of this area would have been?
Yes, that's a great question, and no is the answer. It's difficult because we can tell that this town is most likely controlling some of the region that's immediately following it. And we can see that when the archaic complex is destroyed, that habitation moves from the hilltop down into the valley, which happens kind of across Etruria in this area. But we don't have enough we don't have enough of the non-elite architecture to really know like concrete numbers. So there's some ways you could estimate it by maybe like how many water sources you have, but we only find wells so far that are linked to some of these more monumental buildings. And because we don't have exports of the objects throughout the region, it's harder to determine like how widespread the influence is, but we kind of generally assume that this is like a center in a rural space that the areas around it are kind of coming in and using for consuming the objects from it. Thanks. Yes.
Is there any other archaeology information that coincides with this idea that the left part of the animal or the right part of the animal was important in some way? Do we see that anywhere else?
Well, we see it in Greek sanctuaries that have good faunal data, which is a somewhat limited pool. It's been studied there, and we can see that right sides are preferenced. In general, it seems like the right side, like in the modern world, is preferenced. So we know that like Romans are driving wagons on the right side of the streets, which we can tell from wear patterns and roads. People are entering doorways usually on the right, which we can tell from the door jambs at Pompeii. So it seems in general that the right side is preferenced over the left. But in terms of other objects that have right side or left side preference, we don't have other examples that I'm aware of. Some butchers have said that the left side is fattier, but that was sort of a local Tuscan interpretation of why they're doing this. Yes.
I was just curious, I'm fascinated by the destruction.
Yeah.
What do you think was the cause of the burning down of the building itself as part of the general destruction of the area? You mentioned there was a broken altar into a well. Is it all part of a great sort of catastrophe?
Yeah, so it seems like the orientalizing destruction, the one with the footprints on the tiles, is a fire that takes out the whole hilltop. So the whole building complex is all burned down at the same time. And then they have to essentially like re-level it to build again. So we see that the people don't leave, they're still there, and they scrape dirt and lime across to make it level and then build again. And we can see that really well on the stratigraphy. So that's probably, I would imagine, an accident that takes out the hilltop. The archaic complex, when it's destroyed, it's definitely intentional. And because they're kind of beefing up their defenses right beforehand, it seems like there's probably rising tensions in the region. And those tensions come to a head at the end of the archaic period, and the building is knocked down. But it's knocked down with some care. It's not just like destroyed and left to the open air. It is sort of, the sculptures are like thrown away in deposition pits, which you would maybe do if you were also Etruscan and thought they might have, religious or ritual significance to it.
Thank you.
Yes.
Again, what exactly are the years that we're looking at?
So
When to when?
the 7th century for the Orientalizing period, and then into the 6th in the Archaic.
I hate the use of Oriental. That is interesting how our ears have already changed. Hearing that word and putting some assignation to it that has nothing to do with, you know, archaeology, just the use of the word.
Yeah, I know our terms and how you name things are important, especially when they have context that you might bring up that's not related to it. And it's one of those things, like so many things in archaeology, where we might disagree with the name, but there's no like new name that's used. So if you read anything about this time period in Etruscan scholarship, you have to see like this is the term that is used. And while that's changing, it's sort of changing slowly. So you have to know both in order to be able to research in this period. Okay, there's a question from online that says, could you speak a bit, please, about the influence of Greek workshops on the Etruscan model at Poggio Civitate? The Greek influence on architecture is obvious, but were workshop methods of crafting borrowed or evolved as well? Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the workshop building itself, it seems to be a very local type of construction, having this open air building. There's a partial other one that's excavated actually at Montalcino, the famous wine town, that's very fragmentary because it's under modern buildings, that seems to be a similar kind of open air column building. In terms of Greek influence on these production processes, this is a really touchy topic when it comes to architectural terracottas, because there's a bit of a debate about whether architectural terracottas develop independently in Etruria or if they're brought, as texts tell us, by one craftsman from Greece into Italy. And it seems like for our site that there are certainly Greek objects that have been imported. There's Greek pottery that we find, which is helpful because it's very datable whenever we do find it. But in terms of architectural terracottas, it does seem like they are really innovating over time. And so they kind of learn how to better make these terracottas throughout these different styles of production over time. Yes.
Just a kind of general question. What's the latest theory on where the Etruscans came from? Because I was following her more in decades past, and that was around their hot topic, but I don't know if it's been settled over. There's been more information.
Yes, so for a long time, there's a story in text that tells us that the Etruscans like emigrate into Italy as a result of like great famine in the coast of Turkey. And so they move and have half their population leave for Italy. And so for a long time, there was maybe suggestions that this was the case, or that the Etruscans come from over the Alps and come down from the north, that this is why their language group is different than the other ones that surround them. But the more recent theory that is accepted is that they're just indigenous Italians that sort of get a kind of shared culture in northern Italy that then spreads through central Italy. So the Villanovan culture, which is the Iron Age in Italy, for a long time was thought to be separate, and that was why it was named after its site. But it's now generally fairly accepted that that's indigenous Italians that then are raised up in this area that just have a different language group that kind of disperses over time.